The animals most deformed by consanguinity, when incest destroys entire species. This is the dark history that few know, a history that has shaped the fate of entire bloodlines in the silent, isolated farms of rural America. For decades, practices of consanguineous reproduction have taken magnificent species to the brink of functional extinction, leaving them with anomalies so severe they challenge our very understanding of nature. Our investigation begins in the year 1953, within the isolated mountains of Western Virginia. Here, the Peterson family managed one of the largest applicable horsepower properties in the entire United States. Harold Peterson, the family patriarch and a man of limited vision, held a firm belief that he could improve the race through what he called blood purification, the systematic crossing of closely related animals to preserve desirable characteristics. At that time, knowledge about genetics was extremely limited among rural breeders, explains Dr. Leonard Mitchell, a historian of veterinary medicine at Cornell. Many believed that crossing between close relatives would intensify the animal's higher qualities, completely unaware of the devastating biological consequences that would follow. The Peterson property was situated more than 30 kilometers from the nearest town, nestled in a valley surrounded by densely wooded mountains. This geographic isolation provided Harold with the perfect environment to conduct his experiments without any supervision or interference. Few visitors were ever allowed, and veterinarians were rarely called, even in times of necessity. During the early years, the results appeared promising. The Appaloosa horses from Peterson Farm displayed stunning coat patterns, with unique spots that attracted buyers willing to pay high prices. But behind this apparent aesthetic perfection, a silent tragedy had already begun to unfold. By 1958, the first foals with visible anomalies were being born. Atrophied front legs, abnormally small eyes, and mandibular deformities were merely the beginning. Harold, however, attributed these occurrences to isolated birth accidents and continued his practice, now crossing animals that were themselves the products of consanguineous relationships. What we saw in the veterinary records that survived from that time was truly alarming, says Dr. Elaine Harris, a geneticist specializing in veterinary medicine. The notes from the only veterinarian who visited the farm in 1960 describe foals with immune systems so compromised they would succumb to common infections within days. Some were born with exposed organs or had severe heart problems that prevented them from surviving more than a few hours. The situation deteriorated rapidly between 1960 and 1963. The adult horses began to exhibit abnormal behaviors. Some became inexplicably aggressive, while others developed repetitive movement patterns, shaking their heads incessantly or walking in circles for hours. The mares were increasingly difficult to get in foal, and when they did, they often suffered miscarriages or delivered their foals stillborn. The case of the Peterson horses might have remained just another sad, undocumented episode in the history of American animal breeding, were it not for Raymond Foster, a young National Geographic photographer who visited the region in 1964 for a project on the Appalachian Mountains. Foster arrived at the property by accident when his Jeep broke down nearby, says John Harrison, a local historian and author of the book Secrets of Rural Breeding, The Untold Stories. What he witnessed would forever change the way we understand the effects of consanguinity on animal populations. The photographs taken by Foster, although never published by the magazine due to their disturbing content, documented the result of 11 years of systematic consanguineous crossing. They showed horses with deformed skulls, misaligned jaws that prevented proper nutrition, atrophied limbs, and skin with areas completely devoid of hair. Most striking were the eyes. Many animals had microphthalmia, a condition where the eyes do not develop completely, or anophthalmia, the total absence of ocular tissue. What Foster documented was the complete collapse of a genetic lineage, says Dr. Paul Whitman, a geneticist at the National Institute of Animal Health. Records indicate that by the time Foster visited the farm, approximately 78% of the adult animals had some visible deformity, and the foal mortality rate had reached almost 90%. Harold Peterson, however, seemed utterly unable to recognize his own responsibility for the situation. In personal diaries discovered after his death, he attributed the problems to external forces, from the quality of the water to alleged radiation from nuclear tests performed in the West. He never considered that his own reproduction practices were the cause of the disaster. Make sure you're subscribed to this channel so you don't miss any of the stories that reveal the darkest secrets of human intervention in nature. These are truths that few have the courage to face. But we all need to know them, to avoid repeating the same devastating mistakes of the past. When veterinary authorities in the state of Virginia finally intervened on the Peterson property in March of 1965, they found a situation even more serious than Raymond Foster's photographs had suggested. Of the 143 horses originally recorded on the farm, only 67 remained alive. And of these, only 12 were in a condition considered acceptable by basic animal health standards. The official report contained descriptions that shocked even the most experienced veterinarians, explains Dr. Margaret Wilson, who had access to the State Agriculture Department's archives during her research. There were horses with duplicate organs, incomplete digestive systems, and skeletal deformities so severe the animals could barely stand. One of the most iconic cases documented was that of Midnight Star, a 4-year-old stallion who had been the pride of Harold Peterson. The animal, the product of 5 generations of consanguineous crosses, had a black coat with perfectly symmetrical white spots, a characteristic for which Peterson had selected intensively. However, Midnight Star suffered from a rare cardiac condition. His heart had only 3 functional chambers instead of 4, causing the animal to live in a constant state of hypoxia and fatigue. The case of Midnight Star perfectly exemplifies the fundamental problem of intensive consanguinity, says Dr. Thomas Reynolds, a veterinary geneticist. Harold selected only for the visible characteristic of the coat, without understanding that he was simultaneously concentrating deleterious recessive genes that would normally remain hidden in genetically diverse populations. The science behind this disaster is complex, yet fundamentally clear. When closely related animals reproduce, the probability that offspring inherit 2 copies of the same harmful gene increases dramatically. If these genes carry mutations, something common in all species, the result is the manifestation of diseases and anomalies that would normally remain latent. In healthy populations, these harmful genes are diluted by genetic diversity, explains Dr. Harris. Think of it as a deck of cards. If you have a complete deck, the chance of drawing a specific card is relatively small. But if you remove most cards, leaving only a few suits, your chance of repeatedly drawing the same card increases exponentially. This is what happens with problematic genes in consanguineous populations. Laboratory records from tests performed on the surviving horses revealed alarming levels of homozygosity, the condition where an organism has identical copies of a gene on both chromosomes inherited from its parents. While healthy horse populations typically show homozygosity rates between 3% and 10%, the Peterson animals displayed rates between 42% and 68%. With such homozygosity levels, it was not a matter of if genetic problems would appear, but how many and how severe, says Dr. Whitman. The immune system, embryonic development, metabolism, all fundamental biological systems were compromised. The effects of consanguinity were not limited to physical deformities. The veterinarians noticed deeply disturbed behavioral patterns among the animals. Mares systematically rejected their foals, an extremely rare behavior in healthy horses. Other animals exhibited self-destructive behaviors, biting their own flanks until they caused serious wounds or repeatedly hitting their heads against the walls of their stalls. What we were observing was the collapse not only of the physical body, but also of neurological systems, explains Dr. James Bradford, a neuroscientist who later studied preserved brain tissue samples from the Peterson horses. Post-mortem analyses revealed significant malformations in the hippocampus and other brain structures crucial for instinctive behaviors and emotional regulation. One of the most tragic aspects of the Peterson case was the prolonged suffering imposed on the animals. Harold, unable to recognize or accept that his own practices were the cause, refused to euthanize even the worst affected horses. Records indicate that many severely deformed animals were kept alive for years, unable to perform basic natural behaviors like running, grazing properly, or interacting normally with others of their species. The Peterson case was not only a genetic disaster, but also a monumental ethical failure, says Dr. Elizabeth Morgan, a veterinary ethics expert. By prioritizing his distorted vision of purity over the welfare of the animals, Harold created a veritable hell on earth for those creatures. Investigations revealed that Peterson had systematically falsified genealogical records to sell consanguineous foals as if they were from diverse bloodlines. Between 1955 and 1963, he sold approximately 200 horses to farmers and breeders in at least 12 different states, spreading compromised genes through a significant portion of the national Appaloosa genetic pool. The impact of the Peterson case extended far beyond that isolated property, explains Dr. Mitchell. For decades after the intervention, Appaloosa breeders across the country continued to discover genetic anomalies that could be traced back to Peterson's animals. Some of these mutations persist in the breed to this day, albeit at much lower frequencies thanks to deliberate genetic diversification efforts. While the tragedy of the Peterson horses unfolded in the mountains of Virginia, an equally alarming, though less documented, situation was occurring in Clearwater County, Idaho. There, in the dense forests bordering the Clearwater River, an isolated community of farmers dedicated to breeding hunting dogs perpetuated practices that would have devastating consequences for generations of animals. The history of the Clearwater dogs remained largely unknown until 1971, when a veterinarian named Dr. Sarah Jenkins, freshly graduated from the University of Idaho, accepted her first job in the region, says Michael Stevens, author of Lost in the Forests, The Forgotten Northwest Communities of America. What she found would transform her career and our understanding of the effects of consanguinity on domestic canids. The Clearwater community had been established in the 1920s, mainly by families seeking distance from the growing urban development of the post-First World War era. Living off hunting, fishing, and subsistence agriculture, they developed their own culture deeply connected to the surrounding natural environment. Central to their subsistence was hunting, for which they depended heavily on specialized dogs. Over the decades, they developed what they called the Clearwater Hound, which, according to local residents, had superior tracking skills, especially for bears and large felines. The exact origins of the Clearwater Hound are foggy, explains Dr. Robert Thompson, a canine historian and geneticist. Fragmented records suggest an initial mixture of bloodhound, plot hound, and possibly American foxhound. What we know for certain is that from approximately 1940, the region's dog population became extremely endogamic, with new genes rarely introduced. The community, proud of its local dogs, firmly resisted the introduction of outside bloodlines. A notebook found in the old cabin of Elmer Jenkins, one of the most respected breeders in the region, revealed a detailed system of crosses that explicitly favored breeding between siblings, half-siblings, and cousins. The few dogs brought from outside were rarely integrated into the main breeding program. When Dr. Sarah Jenkins arrived in the region in 1971, she found a canine population in an advanced state of genetic collapse. In her professional diary, later published in the Journal of Veterinary Ethics, she documented, "The Clearwater hunting dogs show the most alarming set of congenital anomalies I have ever witnessed. Approximately 60% of puppies are born with cleft palates, while almost 80% develop severe hip dysplasia before the age of 2. Most disturbing is what the locals called Clearwater eye, a condition where the eyes are progressively covered by an opaque membrane, leading to complete blindness around the age of 4. Upon examining the canine population in more detail, Dr. Jenkins found that virtually all 287 dogs in the community could trace their lineage back to just 6 founding animals from the 1930s. The coefficient of inbreeding, a mathematical measure that quantifies the relatedness between individuals, reached astronomical values of 43% to 51%. Values above 10% are already considered worrying in canine populations. With each generation, the conditions worsened. Dr. Jenkins documented litters where more than half of the puppies had cryptorchidism, the failure of testicles to descend, and severe spinal and heart malformations. Even more alarming was the increasing incidence of abnormal behaviors. Younger dogs exhibit deeply disturbed behavioral patterns, she wrote. Many develop compulsive fixations, such as chasing their own tails incessantly or licking certain objects until they cause wounds to their tongues and gums. Cases of sudden and unpredictable aggression have become common, even in previously docile animals. More worrying is the growing tendency of canine mothers to reject, or in extreme cases, attack their own puppies. I have witnessed the empty look in these animals' eyes, creatures carrying the genetic weight of decades of wrong choices. If you are watching and feel the same indignation as I do, leave a comment. Nature deserves respect, not interference. We need to make this message echo so that stories like these are not repeated. Despite the scientific evidence presented by Dr. Jenkins, the community initially resisted her recommendations to introduce genetic diversity. Elmer Jenkins, openly defiant of the veterinarian, then 76 and considered the foremost local authority on canine breeding, argued that diluting the blood of the Clearwater dogs would destroy their special hunting abilities. What we see here is a recurring phenomenon in cases of consanguinity, says Dr. Morgan. Often, breeders develop almost mystical beliefs about the purity of their bloodlines, attributing extraordinary abilities to animals that are actually severely compromised. It is a form of circular thinking where any distinct feature, even a deficiency, is interpreted as proof of exceptionality. The situation reached a critical point in 1973 when a particularly affected litter was born on the central property of the community. Of the 9 puppies, 7 were born with partial anencephaly, a fatal condition where parts of the brain and skull do not develop completely. The 2 survivors developed such erratic and potentially dangerous behaviors that they had to be euthanized before reaching 6 months of age. This event finally broke the community's resistance. With the reluctant permission of the local elders, Dr. Jenkins implemented a genetic rehabilitation program, gradually introducing healthy outside bloodlines while maintaining meticulous kinship records to avoid new consanguineous crosses. Dr. Jenkins's program represents one of the first documented genetic rescue efforts in a canine population, says Dr. Thompson. Her meticulous notes on the recovery process provided a model that would later be used in several similar cases worldwide. The process of genetic recovery for the Clearwater dogs was long, methodical, and often frustrating. Dr. Sarah Jenkins faced not only biological challenges but also persistent cultural resistance among the oldest members of the community. Her professional diary, a fundamental reference for understanding this phase of the history, reveals the complex dimensions of the work. April 1974. Today I witnessed something that gave me hope for the first time in months, wrote Dr. Jenkins. Ruby's litter, the result of an outcross with a bloodhound brought from Boise, produced 7 puppies, all seemingly free from the cranial malformations that had become almost universal here. More significantly, I saw Elmer Jenkins, the most resistant to my intervention, smiling as he watched the pups suckle vigorously, a rare behavior in recent litters. A small step, but perhaps a turning point. The recovery program implemented by Dr. Jenkins followed principles that, although known in theory, had rarely been so systematically applied to an isolated canine population. The strategy had 3 main components: the controlled introduction of new breeding stock, genetic mapping to avoid new consanguineous crosses, and rigorous monitoring of phenotypic and behavioral traits. Dr. Jenkins's approach was notably sophisticated for the time, says Dr. Catherine Miller, a conservation geneticist at the University of Colorado. Without access to modern genetic sequencing technologies, she created a diversity score system based on observable characteristics and known genealogy. Essentially, she was practicing advanced population genetics using only clinical observation and meticulous records. Over the first 2 years of the program, 14 outbred dogs were introduced, carefully selected to preserve the functional characteristics valued by the community, such as a keen sense of smell and physical endurance, while diversifying the genetic pool. Dr. Jenkins insisted on maintaining detailed records of every birth, thoroughly documenting physical characteristics, exam results, and observed behaviors. The initial results were encouraging, but not without complications. The 3rd generation of outcrosses showed a significant reduction in the most serious physical anomalies, with the incidence of cleft palates falling to approximately 12% compared to the previous 60%. However, behavioral problems persisted, particularly tendencies toward hyperactivity and socialization difficulties. The Clearwater case taught us a crucial lesson about genetic recovery, explains Dr. Thompson. Some traits, particularly those related to complex neurological and behavioral systems, can remain compromised for generations after the initial genetic pool diversification. This is because many behavioral traits are polygenic, controlled by multiple genes that can remain compromised even after initial interventions. A particularly challenging moment occurred in the winter of 1976 when a severe snowstorm completely isolated the community for almost 3 weeks. During this period, 2 of the main outside breeding dogs died in an accident when a shed roof collapsed under the weight of the snow. This event threatened to reverse some of the progress achieved, but it also demonstrated the community's growing commitment to the program. February 1976. I was genuinely moved today, noted Dr. Jenkins. After losing Rex and Sadie in the shed collapse, I feared we would backslide out of necessity. Instead, Thomas and Gerald Jenkins, Elmer's nephews, traveled 42 miles on foot through the snow to reach the nearest telephone to contact breeders in Lewiston. They returned 5 days later with 3 new, unrelated dogs. The community held a meeting and covered the substantial costs of the acquisition. "The old ways are dying with us," said Gerald, "but the new ones will live with our children." By 1980, the results of the program were undeniable. The Clearwater canine population had grown to approximately 350 animals, with inbreeding coefficients reduced to an average of 8.3%, still elevated by ideal standards, but dramatically better than the average of 47% recorded in 1971. More importantly, the dog's functionality as hunting assistants had not only been preserved but significantly improved. What the Clearwater community discovered, to its surprise, was that the new dogs were superior hunters, says Stevens. With better vision, greater physical endurance, and more stable behavior, they consistently outperformed the remnants of the old bloodlines in all practical aspects of hunting. This was probably the most convincing factor for the most skeptical members of the community. Clearwater eye, the corneal dystrophy that had previously condemned almost all dogs to progressive blindness, had become relatively rare, affecting less than 5% of the population. Severe skeletal anomalies had been reduced to levels comparable to those of normal canine populations. More significantly, abnormal behaviors such as self-harm and impulsive aggression had decreased dramatically. Dr. Jenkins's work in Clearwater was finally published in the prestigious journal Genetics and Animal Conservation in 1982, bringing international attention to the case. Her article, Genetic Recovery in Isolated Canine Populations, the Clearwater Model, became essential reading in veterinary medicine and genetic conservation programs. The most important legacy of the Clearwater case was not just the dogs saved in that specific community, concludes Dr. Miller. It was the practical demonstration that populations severely compromised by consanguinity can be recovered with methodological and patient intervention. The principles established by Jenkins have since been applied in various situations, from work birds on the brink of functional extinction to wild populations isolated in fragmented natural reserves. This scientific legacy, however, does not diminish the reality of the suffering experienced by the animals during the decades that preceded the intervention. As Dr. Jenkins herself wrote in her final reflections, every documented malformation, every observed abnormal behavior, represents a sentient life experiencing unnecessary pain and confusion. The true triumph will come when such interventions become unnecessary, when we finally understand that diversity is not just statistically desirable but ethically imperative. While the cases of the Peterson horses and Clearwater dogs may seem like relics of a less enlightened past, the uncomfortable truth is that similar practices continue to occur in various contexts of contemporary animal breeding. The lessons of these historical cases remain profoundly relevant in the 21st century. The phenomenon we see today is more insidious because it often hides under the cloak of preservation or breed purity, explains Dr. Elena Rodriguez, an expert in animal welfare and breeding ethics. In many modern dog breeds, for example, alarming inbreeding coefficients are normalized in the name of arbitrary aesthetic standards. One of the most emblematic cases of the modern era involves the English Bulldog, a breed whose gene pool has become so restricted that recent genomic studies suggest its current genetic diversity is equivalent to what would exist if only 68 unrelated dogs had founded the entire modern population. The modern bulldog is essentially a walking warning letter about the dangers of consanguinity, says Dr. Whitman. Virtually all of them suffer from severe brachycephaly, leading to chronic breathing problems so serious that many airlines refuse to transport them due to the risk of death during flight. More than 80% require cesarean sections for reproduction because the selection for large heads and wide shoulders has made natural birth impossible. The genetic consequences of consanguinity are not limited to specific breeds or particular species. The situation has become particularly alarming in the dairy cattle breeding industry. A study published in 2019 revealed that 99% of Holstein bulls used for artificial insemination in the United States can trace their lineage back to just 2 founding animals from the 1960s. The situation of Holstein cattle is a perfect example of how economic pressures can accelerate genetic disasters, says Dr. Frank Anderson, an expert in production animal genetics. The intensive selection for milk production has resulted in cows that produce impressive quantities, over 30,000 liters per lactation compared to 5,000 from a typical 1950s cow, but with devastating consequences for longevity, fertility, and animal welfare. Modern Holstein cows typically survive only 4 to 5 years in production, compared to a natural lifespan expectancy of 15 to 20 years. Fertility problems have become so common that many farms consider it normal for a cow to need 3 to 5 inseminations to conceive successfully, when historically 1 or 2 were enough. What we are witnessing is a form of genetic extremism, continues Dr. Anderson. We are essentially creating animals that are efficient short-term milk production machines but fundamentally dysfunctional as complete biological organisms. The case of the show Arabian horse represents another worrying contemporary example. Selection for extreme facial characteristics, particularly the concave profile known as the dish face, has resulted in a population where neurological, respiratory, and dental problems have become common. Some of the award-winning Arabian horses in major shows have cranial malformations so extreme they would have been considered severe deformities just 50 years ago, explains Dr. Wilson. We see animals with nostrils so small they dramatically limit respiratory capacity, and facial profiles so concave they result in chewing problems and dental malocclusion. All in the name of an aesthetic standard that has been taken to the extreme. Perhaps even more disturbing is the silence that often surrounds these problems. Breeders, show judges, and breed associations often minimize or completely ignore the genetic consequences of these practices, focusing exclusively on the aesthetic characteristics valued in the competition circuit. There is a conspiracy of silence in the world of animal breeding, says Dr. Howard Bennett, a veterinarian and former dog show judge who has become a vocal critic of modern practices. Behind the scenes, everyone recognizes the problems. We see puppies that die from heart malformations, adults that can barely breathe, and animals that develop devastating neurological conditions. But publicly, we continue to reward the most extreme specimens, perpetuating the cycle. In the context of wild animals and conservation programs, the lessons from the Peterson and Clearwater cases acquire additional importance. When populations of threatened species are reduced to critically low numbers, the risk of inbreeding depression becomes a significant challenge for recovery efforts. The case of the cheetah, Acinonyx jubatus, dramatically illustrates this phenomenon. Genetic studies show that the worldwide population went through at least 2 severe genetic bottlenecks, periods when the population was reduced to such low numbers that genetic diversity was drastically reduced. Modern cheetahs have such limited genetic diversity that they are practically clones of each other from an immunological point of view, explains Dr. Samantha Lewis, a conservation biologist. This means a single infectious disease could potentially decimate the entire population, as all individuals share the same immunological vulnerabilities. It is like having a human population where everyone has exactly the same blood type and the same allergies. This genetic homogeneity manifests in alarming reproductive problems. More than 70% of male cheetah sperm have morphological abnormalities, and semen quality is consistently low. Females often produce small litters, and cub mortality is significantly higher than in species with greater genetic diversity. What we see in the cheetah today is the result of natural consanguinity forced by population reductions, continues Dr. Lewis. But the worrying thing is that we are deliberately creating similar situations in captive populations of other threatened species when we do not adequately manage genetic diversity. The irony is that while the negative effects of consanguinity are well documented and scientifically understood, practices that promote genetic homogeneity continue to prevail in various animal breeding contexts. This disconnect between scientific knowledge and practical application represents one of the greatest challenges for animal welfare in the 21st century. We know better, but we often don't do better, says Dr. Rodriguez. Historical cases like Peterson and Clearwater should serve as powerful warnings, but instead we often repeat the same errors on even larger scales, now with the aid of advanced reproductive technologies. Artificial insemination, for example, allows a single sire to generate tens of thousands of offspring, something impossible through natural reproduction. When this sire carries problematic genes, the negative impact is exponentially amplified throughout the population. In the age of reproductive biotechnology, the risks of genetic homogeneity are even greater, warns Dr. Whitman. A popular dairy bull may have its semen distributed globally and produce more than 100,000 offspring. If we later discover it carries a problematic genetic mutation, the damage is already disseminated across multiple generations and geographies. The fundamental question that emerges from these historical and contemporary cases is one of ethics, responsibility, and our relationship with other species. Intensive consanguinity represents a form of human interference in the fundamental biology of other creatures that often results in unnecessary suffering. What the cases of Peterson and Clearwater teach us, above all, is about humility, reflects Dr. Morgan. They remind us that interfering with the basic evolutionary mechanisms that maintain the health of animal populations often results in unintentional but profoundly harmful consequences. Genetic diversity is not a luxury or an abstract preference. It is the foundation of health and biological functionality. There are, however, encouraging signs of change. In 2019, the United Kingdom's Kennel Club implemented new guidelines for breeders of English bulldogs, French bulldogs, and pugs, aiming to reduce extreme brachycephaly in these breeds. Outcrossing programs have been started for particularly compromised breeds, carefully introducing genetic material from related breeds to expand the gene pool without losing essential defining characteristics. The Outcross for Dalmatians program is an excellent example of how we can address genetic problems without abandoning the concept of defined breeds, explains Dr. Thompson. By introducing a single cross with a pointer, followed by generations of pure Dalmatian breeding, they addressed a serious urinary issue. In the context of wild species conservation, sophisticated strategies for genetic management are being implemented to maximize genetic diversity in reduced populations. The Mexican Wolf Recovery Program, Canis Lupus Bailei, for example, uses advanced genomic analyses to determine the ideal crosses between captive individuals, maximizing the retention of genetic variation. We are finally recognizing that preserving numbers alone is not enough, says Dr. Lewis. We need to preserve functional genetic diversity if we want these species to survive in the long term. A purely numerical success that results in a genetically compromised population is not truly a conservation success. As we advance into the 21st century, the lessons of Peterson and Clearwater remain fundamental to our understanding of ethical responsibility in animal breeding and conservation. These stories remind us that our power to shape other species through reproductive selection brings with it the obligation to understand and respect the fundamental biological principles that underpin animal health and welfare. The true legacy of these cases is not only in the suffering they documented, but in the lessons they offer us, concludes Dr. Rodriguez. They show us that respect for biological integrity and genetic diversity is not only scientifically sound but ethically imperative. Our interventions in animal reproduction should be guided not only by aesthetic or productive goals, but by a fundamental commitment to the welfare of the animals under our care. If you've watched this far, it's because this story resonated with you. Leave a comment saying "I watched here" so I can get to know you and identify who truly appreciates the stories here on the channel. Be sure to subscribe to follow our investigations that reveal the darkest and most educational truths about the impacts of human intervention on animal nature. Leave your like to support this work of awareness, and share it with friends and family who need to know these important stories about the consequences of animal consanguinity. Together, we can promote a future where respect for genetic diversity and animal welfare guides our breeding and conservation practices.